Welcome to Mindset Matters, the official podcast of Oregon Realtors. In this podcast, we dive deep into the secrets of top-performing agents, market trends, strategies, tips, and tricks that will transform and elevate your real estate career to new heights. Follow or subscribe today, and stay tuned for a podcast that's not just about real estate. It's about mastering the mindset for success. Hello, Oregon Realtors. Welcome back to the Mindset Matters podcast. Today, we're diving into the big picture, looking at key forces driving our economy, both here in Oregon and across the nation. From housing and job growth to interest rates, inflation, and what's happening on Main Street versus Wall Street, we'll explore how national trends are shaping our state and vice versa. Whether you're a business owner, broker, policymaker, or just trying to keep up to date on the news, you won't want to miss this conversation. So let's get into it. Today, we are fortunate to have a guest that has a wealth of expertise on the economic landscape at all levels. Mark McMullen served as the longest tenured chief economist for the state of Oregon under 4 governors. That must have been interesting. He must have some good stories. Mark now serves as the Vice President of Policy and Research with the Common Sense Institute Oregon, providing data-driven research to help educate and inform on issues impacting Oregonians. Before joining CSI, in addition to his role as Chief Economist for the state, Mark held a variety of prominent roles, including Director of Consulting at Moody's Analytics and Research at the Congressional Budget Office. He earned his degree from Pomona College and completed his graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Alongside his professional accomplishments, Mark finds joy in his 28-year marriage. Congratulations. I don't think people can say that. And cherishes time spent with his 3 adult children. So welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Before we dive into some stats and what's happening across the state, could you talk a little bit about what Common Sense Institute is? And for our listeners, the Oregon Realtors is a founding member of Common Sense Institute Oregon. So we are on the board. So it's really awesome. We have a direct link to Mark and the rest of the Common Sense Institute team to help us research issues and provide information to you and policymakers on what matters the most to this industry. So before we dive into that in specific, tell us a little bit about CSI, what your role is, and what CSI Oregon is focused on.
Sure. And off the bat, I'd really like to thank you all for your support. It's been really invaluable to us, not just in terms of the financial side of it, but all the advice you give us. As we're digging into real estate topics or related topics, your expertise has been very valuable.
Great.
And really gives us
so it's a win-win for us both.
Absolutely. So I think it really does make our end product better. So what CSI really does is try to research the policies that are of greatest interest to Oregonians right now. And what sets us apart is that we are nonpartisan, and that unlike most of the policy research you see out there, we haven't been commissioned by stakeholders. Most of the work that gets out there is, paid for by some people who have skin in the game. Either that or a government agency that also has.
So when you say, and I apologize for the interruptions, when you say skin in the game, do you mean business communities, individual? Who has skin in the game? Who are you referencing?
So, well, typically, there are a lot of interest groups out there, obviously, who are working to influence and advocate for their industries or for their stakeholders, and are trying to change the minds of policymakers. While we'd like to move the needle as well, what we try to set apart is to really just do facts-based research, try to get those numbers out there for households, firms, and policymakers, and so that they have, something that they can trust isn't coming from a place of self-interest.
Right. Got it. Makes sense. Okay, so there is Common Sense Institute, the umbrella, and then there are different states that have their own. What is the difference between, obviously, a Common Sense Institute, the respective state is going to focus on the issues impacting that state, and the parent company, so to speak, will focus on what exactly?
Yeah, so our central office is in Colorado, and they've been around going on 20 years now, and they've started to expand. Now we're in 4 states, and Oregon has just really ramped up its activities for a little bit more than a year now. And so there is some overlap in terms of some of the issues that are important in all states. Cost of crime, and we've done, multi-state studies on fentanyl and financial fraud and things that really kind of cross borders. But that said, we like to focus on more Oregon-specific issues here and what's the most, burning topics. And so during this last legislative session, we, of course, did quite a bit in terms of the real estate market because there were a lot of things out there. And so we did do housing summaries. We did some studies on system development charges, some works on construction defect liability reform.
Which really helped us pass that legislation in the 2025 session. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad to hear we moved the needle
Yes,
somewhere.
we moved the needle, definitely.
And labor agreements and the like. And so, of course, this session, it was more broadly, the biggest issues, were housing and transportation and the like. Education, of course, is always big.
So before you get into the big picture numbers, let's focus on the construction defect liability research you did to help our advocacy team and others in other states. What was the issue? What were you focused on in your research and the data you were providing to us, our advocacy team, and others? I mean, is it a common theme with the construction defect liability laws across the country, or what's the issue? Or what was the issue? Probably still the issue.
Well, yeah, Oregon is an outlier. It continues to be, even after we've moved a little bit closer to the rest of the states in terms of how long you can come back and sue a developer and how easy it is to do that.
Can you give an example?
So, well, yes.
What do you mean?
So, if you have faulty siding or even if just your paint bubbles, Oregon's law, several years down the road, the developer is still on the hook. And so this has really depressed condominium development.
Why condominium? Just because the defects could be more expensive and liability larger than a single family resident?
More so than relative to an apartment complex where the residents aren't owners. We have seen a different history in terms of this multifamily building, whether the mix between apartments and condominiums. And in Oregon, we don't really see any condominiums and haven't ever since the housing bust.
And that one of the reasons is due to builders don't want to take on the extra added liability that they'd potentially be subjected to.
Absolutely. At first, right, as the housing market more broadly, after the crash, and we still were at the bottom, it was pretty much all states had no real condominium development, and that was explained by the fact that rents were so high. For apartment rents were sky high across the country, and so developers went that direction at first. But then, as the rents started to normalize in recent years, most states started to see an increase in their condominium development. And that didn't happen here. And that's a problem because home ownership is really the best pathway for wealth generation. Here in Oregon, most of our residents, that's their primary generator of wealth. They don't have lucrative businesses or big stock portfolios to invest in, and some do, but for most households, it's really their primary residence is their main wealth generator, and condominiums are at a much lower price point to get in to home ownership.
And in a state that has passed legislation to allow for high density housing, it seems like a good opportunity to help reduce the shortage of housing units faster.
Absolutely, absolutely, and like I say, in particularly owner occupied ones, which generate wealth and they help heal some of these historical disparities in wealth, which are much wider than current income.
Yeah. So, in addition to the passage of the current legislation, which helped reduce, we call it the ultimate statute of repose, like statute of limitations from 10 years to 7 years on, which
Correct.
is a little better for builders. It's still probably a year longer than they're typically subjected to. What else do we need to do to help increase housing supply, not just in condo market, but in single family residential?
Yeah, more broadly, I think a lot of things. Now, some of it is happening. Unfortunately, a lot of the shock that we took during the housing downturn, over a decade ago now, that had very long-term hangovers. So we had issues that are broadly across the country in terms of, lending standards were increased dramatically. Banks and credit unions didn't want to have housing on their ledger, and they still had some bad stuff there, and so they really wanted to keep that out of their portfolio.
They were giving away money like candy to buyers
Yeah.
who weren't necessarily qualified.
So you get pendulum shift, and the same thing for regulators in terms of land development loans and whatnot, where federal and state regulators make it much harder to invest. That had lasting implications. Construction workforce and the prices of construction materials have the prices of construction materials are really kind of outside of the realm of the market, but the construction workforce wasn't, because one of the things that happened when all the jobs dried up and the building activity dried up is that young workers weren't able to get into the trades, and there weren't any jobs there. And so 10 years later, it's those young workers who would be branching out and starting their own construction firms. And as a result, we've seen a lot fewer in terms of the number of firms out there and less competition among them. But that's starting to resolve, but it just takes time because we lost this whole generational cohort of young workers who would have learned the trades, been apprentices, and then decided to branch off on their own going
That's the
forward.
domino effect, right? You can't get workers, you can't get buildings and housing completed, and it just goes on and on. And then there was COVID, hurt the supply chain, right? The ability to get the materials. So how is let's focus on that for a second. How is the construction workforce now? Is it robust? Are they still looking? Is there a shortage of construction workers? I suppose we can talk about employment in general within Oregon.
Still struggling in terms of the construction workforce in particular. Obviously, uh, it's lightened up a little bit as the overall market, job market has weakened, so that does help a little bit, but it wasn't more than a year or two ago when it was very common to fly in a construction workforce and rent out a hotel and keep them, from out of state, just to work here. And so that's an issue. It always has been. Of course, in addition to these broader macroeconomic nationwide issues that I've talked about so far, Oregon has its own special issues as well. A lot of regulation, difficulty with system development charges, and all sorts of things that make it hard. And permitting, is very slow here, and things that
Can you
make
break
it
that
hard to
down
get.
in layman terms? I mean, system development charges, if you're in new construction, you sure understand, or if you've applied for a permit in some local jurisdiction, but are those regulated at the local municipality or the state? And how are those impacting everything you just said?
Yeah, it's mostly at the state and county level. So what happens is, if you want to do a housing development, you're going to need sidewalks, and you're going to need utilities, and you're going to need all sorts of resources, streetlights and the like. And so construction was more welcomed by some of our communities. 20 years ago, the communities would pony up for a large share of these charges.
It was an incentive to help the developer say, hey, you bring a housing development
That
here, 30 houses, we'll put in the sidewalks for you at our cost, or whatever.
Exactly.
Oh.
But now the localities are less willing to do that. And so it makes it a big burden on a developer to take on all of that expense up front and take out these loans up front, a lot of it being aspirational about hoping that, the project is going to work out. And so there's a lot of risk there, and they have to pay a lot of insurance and whatnot when they take out these loans, and they have high rates on those loans. And so it makes it very difficult to do.
So this may be out of the economist perspective, but for a developer, just thinking process in my head, for a developer, they find a piece of land and they have the architectural drawings and other planned community drawings, which would include sidewalk, whatever it includes for that community. They take that plan, submit it to the local county or the municipality who reviews and says, oh, yeah, you can do that, but you're going to be responsible for A, B, and C. And then goes back to the developer. He has to figure out the cost for all the things he's going to be responsible for and assess. I assume it all gets passed down to the consumer eventually.
Yes, it does. It works its way straight into the home price.
So then what's is that the proper process? Is that how it goes? Or what happens once the developer has to get approval from the local municipality, it goes back, the developer might hire a builder, or the developer could be the builder, and then on it goes, plat maps and lots, and it's a long process, huh?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's part of the constraint. And here in Oregon, it seems to be longer than other places
Why is that?
in terms of the permitting.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with both the budget constraints for our local governments, as well as a lot of the citizen involvement in the process, where we do have a lot of not in my backyard kind of sentiment here in Oregon.
Yes.
And so it's very hard, democratic local government sometimes to.
How do we get around that? Because it's it seems like it's the same argument that never changes. We are short so many housing units. We have to build somewhere. Well, we have land that works, and the communities say that land won't work. Either it's infill or it won't work for housing, or yeah, you might have certain land designated, but that's not going to work. We need more land brought in, and it's such a fight all the time. You can't have it both ways. We got to find that compromise. What, in your opinion, is the solution so that we can achieve both? Let's make the NIMBYs sort of happy, but we also got to satisfy, like the governor mandate and others, increased housing. You want more workforce? You need housing.
Yeah, and I think there are some solutions, and I think a lot of policymakers were looking at them in this session in terms of opening up, of course, more land for development or allowing land swaps. Say, okay, this is more appropriate place to build than this one where we have, permission to build, and this where we don't is a more appropriate place. Can we swap these out? Can we open up some public lands for this purposes in terms of the system development charges? Concept of having a state bank or fund to go ahead and take good care of some of these upfront costs for developers so they could pay them over time, at the very beginning of a project, not such an overbearing cost. But I think what would be important is to maybe change some of our land use laws across different areas, because different areas of the state have different needs. And I think it's very difficult, particularly in some of the more isolated areas for more buildable land.
Can you give an example? I mean, if you want to refer to a specific area in the state, please do. We won't hold it against you. It's just facts.
Well, there's a lot of places, but what happens is they want to try to keep the size of the buildable land in proportion to the amount that population is expected to grow, so that you expand, the buildable land over time to reflect the increase in, the housing needs.
And they base that on trends because it's
That's
different.
right.
I mean, migration in, migration out can depend a lot on.
So you pick a place, Douglas County, Klamath County, somewhere that hasn't seen population gains for some time, and so the outlook for population growth isn't, negligible. So they're not allowed to expand their buildable land, but it's how are we going to start drawing people if we don't have places for them?
They probably have lots of land in those two locations you referenced,
or workforce housing, or Pendleton, or places like that, where they say, oh well, how are we ever going to grow if we don't have somewhere to house the workforce? But the flip side of that is it's kind of aspirational. It's, if you build it, they will come. And that's probably not the case for every community in Oregon. And so it's a little bit tricky, but I think the policy can't really be one size fits all.
Yes, exactly. And that's what with past legislation that's passed. I know they want high density housing, but a high rise in Grants Pass is probably not the right community for a high rise. I mean, downtown core, the urban cores, I get it. It makes sense. But in many of our communities, probably most outside of the urban core, high density housing just doesn't seem like the right model.
Yeah. Outside of some of our, I suppose, vacation or resort areas, maybe. But yes, only in our largest metro areas does that really fit.
So what is the most pressing need in Oregon right now where we need reform? I mean, obviously we know in the realtor world, housing is a huge issue, but overall, from an economic perspective, what is the greatest need in Oregon and where we need some change quick?
Well, I would focus on housing largely these recent population trends, where in Oregon we have always had this comparative advantage whenever there are jobs here. Ever since the dawn of time, Lewis and Clark, for crying out loud, or maybe the land bridge before it, we've had
When was that?
you know
1800s? Yeah.
yeah, people have come, and not just any but workers, but young skilled workers in their root setting years who are investing in houses and picking their school districts and furnishing those houses, and they're kind of the gold standard for economic development. And we've always had this comparative advantage, except for in one tiny period during the early 1980s when the timber industry restructured and all the mills across the state closed at once. And so at that point, people, we started seeing a little bit of net out migration. But here in the last couple of years, we've seen it as well, but it's a completely fundamentally different situation.
In what way? Talk a little bit about that. So
Well,
migration trends are not good for Oregon and development and employee workforce and all the things that impact the economy.
that's right. That's right. So recently, we've seen a stall out in the migration. Of course, back in the 80s, it's fundamentally different because you were in a small town, there were no jobs,
Mhm.
so you had to leave to find a job. This time around, unemployment rates are low. Most people who want a job can find one, but we were losing people anyway. And this is, the biggest suspect there, getting back around to your original question, was affordability here in Oregon, where affordability had eroded relative to so many states. And that it seemed to be the case insofar as when you look at the patterns of migration, people were moving to less expensive states or less expensive regions of the state. A lot of Eastern Washington and different in Oregon, a lot of our uh, smallest and rural towns that hadn't grown in years at least saw their population stabilize, if not even grow some early on in the pandemic.
So what are the numbers? What are in the last, I don't know if you have it for 24 and 25 to date or 23, what's our migration out numbers and how has that overall impacted? I mean, how bad is the migration numbers?
It's just about flat. It depends on, there are two numbers out there for the census. Portland State University, which is using a lot of our statutes. But for the last couple years, we've seen them just above water, just below water, but depending on who you ask. So it's pretty flat in terms of overall migration in and out. That's not as good as it could be because we are losing population because our birth rates are so low. And we've
So
got
net, are we in the red or are we in the black?
uh,
The net migration.
within the range of error, but we're back up into the black the most recent year, and most people expect that to continue going forward, but at slow rate the growth. Unlike what we've become accustomed to in the past, we're looking at less than 1% growth going forward. A lot of that is really the demographic phenomenon.
So do you think, I mean, because you hear affordability issues, housing affordability issues across the country, every state. I know there's certain areas in every state where you probably can still get a good deal. I'm not sure where. But in Oregon, well, obviously affordability and availability is an issue, but are there other reasons that people are leaving Oregon?
There's a lot of chatter, but not a lot of data yet about tax burdens, particularly in the Portland metropolitan area, because of the local taxes that have been levied recently. And so there's discussions about that.
Yeah.
There's quite a bit of burden there. And it's also a possibility that we have increased the business tax burdens as well with our new corporate activity tax and the like. And so as we lose businesses, we lose a lot of those workers as well.
Yes.
Flow is still the same in terms of inflows aren't terrible. We are now seeing outflows, though, which we haven't seen in the past.
Do you anticipate, and I know it might be a crystal ball prediction, do you anticipate that the business tax and other related business issues will change here in Oregon so that hopefully businesses, A, won't want to leave, and B, maybe will return or reopen?
Well, I think some of it will. I mean, as an economist, we talk about a thing like the invisible hand, and which just means a lot of times the market does correct. And so, for an example of that, a lot of downtown Portland office buildings half full. The rental agreements, over time and need to be renewed. It's going to become a lot cheaper to do business in downtown Portland than it has been in the past.
Yes.
And so you can't expect just because the prices that we might get a little bit of bounce back
Right.
there. Still, there are a lot of issues. What the businesses complain about the most isn't so much taxes. It's the primary cost here, and that's getting labor. And again, we used to be able to bring in anybody we wanted. Well, we don't have MIT or Stanford here, but we were able to bring in the engineers from there at a discount. But now there are issues in terms of the crime and the homelessness and education, childcare, things that are potentially making it harder in the future. And so, we probably need to address some of these policy issues to make sure we're still an attractive place in addition to the housing affordability.
Right. Sounds like we have a lot of work to do here in Oregon.
Absolutely. But, the policymakers I think they are pointed in the right direction.
Good.
It's just
Good to hear.
a lot of it's kind of difficult to pull off, as the transportation package showed.
So how can we, as we wrap up, how can we at the Oregon Realtors help you in your role at CSI to help develop research and papers for our advocacy team to use with policymakers and our members and educate others across the state? What can we do to be better partners for you in developing and drafting? And
Well, I would say continue doing what you're doing. You've been very great at feeding us a lot of information about where these bottlenecks are, where the concerns are, because we still do need to build more. We still have a clear shortage in housing. And and there's 100 different ways to address it. We touched on a handful of them here today. Even though we've seen slower population gains, that we start with this huge hole of a shortage that we have to fill. And plus, even though those population gains have dropped off, the number of households continues to grow pretty quickly. And that's this demographic phenomenon with the millennial population cohort getting into their home buying years. When, at the beginning of the cohort at whatever 25, they're about 20% of people own their own home. By the time you get to the end of the cohort at 40-ish, you're looking more like 65%. This huge ramp up, and in Oregon, we have a big population cohort where it's more than a quarter of our state population is in that are millennials. And so this is putting upward pressure on the number of households and the demand for housing, even though we've seen a little bit of pressure come off in terms of the overall population growth. We still are having a hard time keeping up just with the number of households, much less repairing digging ourselves out of that hole. And so all of these different policy issues to address that, and where to put the housing in terms of attracting workforce and the like, all the feedback we can get from you folks who are both in the local areas and dealing with these statewide issues.
Right.
It's
You can
really
count on that.
invaluable.
You can count on that. We're always here to help. As you know, advocacy is one of our primary functions, and anything we can do to help our advocacy team and our members with information and data so that they can turn around and communicate that to their customers and the legislators and so on. So let's end on a high note. What would you tell our members to stay positive about through the rest of the summer and the rest of the year and looking into 2026?
I think there are a couple of things to be positive about. In particular, again, we are going to continue to see increased demand. And I think that although, affordability has eroded in the last 5 years pretty significantly, I think it's stabilizing now. And so
Which means home prices are not coming down.
which means home prices
Let's be realistic.
are not coming down, not with a shortage of supply and continued growth in the number of folks that need places to live.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to continue to see some healthy growth in home prices. Hopefully, we can get a little bit more construction out there, particularly in some of these areas that have seen drop off in building in particular the North Coast counties and some of them in the farming belt, Lynn, Benton, Polk County, places like that. Hood River has seen a big drop off recently, which is a little bit of a concern. But
overall, keep the faith, work hard, and it'll all come back to you.
Yeah, and I think the volumes will be safe for quite some time. I think prices will continue to go up. I do believe that the outlook is much better for real estate market than many others in the state and the country as a whole.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. We didn't even get to interest rates, but they are what they are, right? And don't expect big changes in the interest rates in the coming year, the rest of the year.
I don't believe so. That's the big question at the U.S. level, is what the monetary policymakers will do. But they're standing pat to wait to see what's happening with these tariffs on prices, because so far it looks like they might be able to engineer this soft landing that they were never able to do before, which means, getting the inflation rate down, and it's pretty close to their target now. It's pretty low now, while keeping the labor market from going into a recession. And so
that is positive.
We've slowed down close, and it's getting close, but they're still going to stand pat until they see how these tariffs work through on prices before they give any kind of aid to.
Well, it sounds like we need to do a part 2 on this, maybe in the last quarter of the year, so we can get an update on what's happening, especially with the tariff situation and other things that could impact the overall economy here in Oregon. So we're going to have you back, Mark.
Well, I'm pretty long-winded, so part 2 might be necessary. But only
good. It's a lot of great information. Thank you so much for being here. We will look forward to having you back as a guest.
Well, thanks again for all your support and advice.
Of course. Thank you, Mark. Have a great rest of the summer.